All right, folks, welcome to Investing for Beginners podcast. Today, we're going to talk about some breaking news. Well, I don't know how breaking it is, but it's new news. We're going to talk about the TikTok effect. There was some news about TikTok recently, and we're going to discuss that and 4 social media stocks that we think you should watch right now and how this is all going to play out. So, Andrew, why don't we tell everybody who haven't heard the news what's going on with TikTok and why is this a thing?
Yeah, let's get breaking news coverage from 2 guys who don't use TikTok personally. And one guy
I don't think I've ever actually been on it.
yeah. One guy who very publicly gives digs to the platform any chance I can get because I'm grumpy and a little bit behind. So I'll reference, there was a great podcast by Wall Street Journal. If you're really interested in the nitty gritty, go check that one out. CNBC also did an article about TikTok and what's been going on there. But from my understanding, just kind of following it, and if you're new to this, maybe this is helpful, but basically TikTok has been a big bargaining chip between China and Trump. And what it's come down to is there was a deadline for TikTok to make a deal so that it was basically US owned rather than China owned. That deadline got pushed back, and then it was just last week, September 17th, where the next deadline was. Apparently at the 11th hour, they made the framework of a deal, whatever that means. But the general idea that's being revealed, and these facts could all change. This is just a framework. Nothing's been set in stone yet. Under the framework deal, according to CNBC, they're going to split the app into a US version and a China version. 80% of the US business for TikTok would have investors, which include Oracle, Silver Lake, and Andreessen Horowitz. The other interesting tidbit about that I read about was that TikTok would still own the algorithm. Like the China TikTok, ByteDance is the parent company. They would still own the algorithm, but they would be essentially licensing it to the US TikTok. From a user perspective, if you're a user on TikTok, you're going to get the option to transfer from the China TikTok to the US TikTok, which I'm just going to make a wild speculation that if this deal goes through in the way that they are saying, everybody's going to eventually make that move because I'm imagining you won't be able to update the app, access new features, things like that until you go to the new US thing. So I don't know, a lot of information, and interesting that it's a bargaining chip between Trump and China, and with everything with tariffs and all the things that you see affecting the big macroeconomics, the big economic picture between the US and China and globally, that TikTok remains a big piece of it, which was once just this silly little app that a few kids used, and now it's reached this big scale.
Yeah, it's really reached a big scale, right? It had a huge impact on Meta and Instagram, and even the old school Facebook that I'm not a boomer yet, but I'm in the range of boomer that we all use, and it's interesting how, as you said, this little app. China has become a big player in the social media sphere and has had a big impact on the negotiations between our country and China as far as trade relations go, and that Trump has been using this as a wedge or a lever to try to work out more favorable terms or conditions for the United States. And so it's interesting how that has all come to pass. My understanding, again, I've only seen this from like the 80,000 foot view, so even less than a 30,000 foot view, is that some of the concerns of why this became an issue was because there was concerns about data and how the Chinese company ByteDance was handling the data and whether that gave the Chinese government access to American information or data. And so that's why this became a thing. And it's going to be interesting to see how that part of it plays out. I truthfully don't know at this point where any of that concern is going to go, if that is all negated because now the company is air quote owned by Oracle. What was the other one? Silver Lake something or other,
Yes. Yes.
that one I've never heard of, and Andreessen Horowitz, which I'm familiar with. So I'm curious to see how that part of the concern with the company, if that will go away or if that will still be a concern, but maybe less of a concern. I'll be interested to see how that plays out.
And how does it affect just Apple, Google in general with their app stores? If you look
Right.
at the biggest companies in the S&P 500, we're in an interesting point in time in history where the S&P 500, if you're new to the stock market, 500 of some of the biggest businesses in the world in this index that when we call the market, that's what we're referring to, a huge percentage of that index today is the big tech companies: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and a couple others. Nvidia obviously missing a big one. But if Apple has the App Store, and we've seen how much they're drawing services being a huge revenue. We just talked about that about a week ago. Revenue really driving the business. And you got to think a lot of that comes from App Store. And then you have Google, Alphabet also through their Android and Google Play getting that revenue. And then just Meta itself. Meta owns Facebook, Instagram. What's the chat
WhatsApp.
they own?
WhatsApp.
WhatsApp. Yeah.
Yep.
And how that affects them. This TikTok thing could swing the market in big ways. Not only just how this event plays out, but also what kind of precedent it sets. Because you got to think that's not going to be the last international app company that faces some sort of political pressure sometime in the future. And what does that mean for where lines are being drawn, where profits are being generated? And if TikTok grows to be something even bigger than what it is now, if TikTok or other apps ever turned into the super app kind of WeChat model that you see with Tencent and some other companies, how does that play into all of this? And does it become a bigger and bigger piece? So I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's already it's playing out in a different way in Europe, for example, with companies like Google, Apple, and Meta, for example, and maybe even Microsoft to a certain extent. But those first three are certainly facing a lot of regulatory scrutiny in Europe, and I won't comment on the political part of that, but it certainly is impacting how those companies think about operating in those regions, and if there is any sort of blowback, so to speak, it could certainly impact the financial performance of a company like Google, for example, if they either have to put restraints on what they offer or how much they do offer in Europe, and that will have an impact unquestionably on the financials of a company like Google. They may see a 10 or 15% impact on their revenues and their profitability down the line. And so I'm just speculating, so that don't hold me to those numbers, but it certainly is going to have an impact if that kind of happens. And so this deal, like you said, with ByteDance and us in the United States and what's going on in Europe, it certainly is setting the forerunner for there being more concerns or more, pushback from governments or from countries overall about how different things are used in their jurisdictions. And what may be appropriate or okay here in the United States may not be kosher in India, for example, and vice versa. And so I think this is probably most definitely setting a precedent for how those are going to play out in the future. And so it's certainly something to be aware of and keep an eye on, because regulatory concerns when you're thinking about companies you want to invest in don't get talked about a lot until they happen, but it is certainly something to probably keep an eye on and keep in mind that, okay, when I invest in a company that operates mostly in, let's say, South Africa, for example, there's different regulatory concerns you have to think about compared to maybe how they operate here in the US, for example. So it's certainly, it bears some keeping in mind and watching for sure.
I mean, I 1,000% agree with that. If that tells you how strongly I feel.
Pretty strong.
Pretty strong. can we bring it back to like a beginner, something practical? Um, when you talk about regulatory risks or any risks, a lot of times it can be on a sliding scale, it could be on a spectrum. Give us, we're not going to hold your feet to the fire, but just like some generalities of examples of countries and stocks where maybe it's more of a concern and maybe less concern. I think South Africa, a great example of, I would put that personally in my too hard pile. I think
Mhm.
the regulatory environment there, owning a stock in South Africa is just way beyond my comfort zone, but that's just me. If you're a beginner looking to get into different international companies, what would you say?
Yeah, the first thing you have to think about is you have to realize that they are operating in it with a different system. They have different values, and they have different things that are important to them, or verboten or forbidden, and other things that are totally kosher or okay, compared to maybe what we think is okay here in the United States. For example, if you invest in a company like, I don't own it, I don't know much about it, but I'll just throw it out there as an example. If you invest in a company like Coupang, which is based out of South Korea, the business model may be very similar to Amazon, for example, which I think it probably is falls in the same kind of style of business model. But the nature of the government in South Korea and the people that are using Coupang are going to have a different outlook and view of how they view different things that a company like Amazon may do. So, for example, here in the United States, Amazon makes it very, 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 very hard to cancel a Prime subscription. Incredibly difficult. And in South Korea, that may be against the law. And so they may have it right up front, broad base, super easy to cancel. And I'm not saying they do or don't. I'm just using that as an example. And that could lead to maybe higher churn than what you're used to if you're looking at a company like Amazon, for example. Think about a company like Visa, a company that I own and Andrew and I both own. When that company operates in different jurisdictions, they're treated differently. And a good case in point is Australia. Australia has a very strict rules on how they govern their debit card and their credit card transactions and the fees that companies using those platforms can charge. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to understand that so that if you're buying, let's say if you're buying another payments company that operates primarily in Australia and maybe tangentially in the United States, you have to understand that the regulatory rules are different. And so the way that the company generates profits is going to be vastly different, and it may be strikingly lower than what you're used to. You look at Visa and they have gross margins of 70, 80%. And you look at a company in Australia and maybe they only have 40. And it doesn't mean that Australia's payment company is a bad company. If you compare it to Visa, it may not look as good, but if you look at it in conjunction with other companies in Australia, it may be pretty good. So when you step into looking at investing in other companies that are outside of the US, you have to understand that they have different rules and different laws and things that they may find okay on a business level, we may not hear, and vice versa. And so you can't always just look blindly and say, "Oh, hey, look at their margins are terrible compared to this." Well, that's because of the nature of where they're operating and how they're operating. And if they had the same rules here in the United States, maybe they kill it. So it's just something to keep in mind. And it doesn't it's not sexy for sure, and it doesn't get a lot of love out there, but it is something to be aware of when you're looking at investing abroad, is that there's different rules, different governments, different levels of what's acceptable in the society. And so you have to be cognizant of that. If you don't, then you could run into trouble.
It's really speaking to that idea of know what you own and why you own it, know how the business makes money, all those sorts of
Yes.
things.
Yes, very much. Those are uber, uber important.
Yeah.
So how do we think this I guess maybe let's talk about how is ByteDance and TikTok, how have they impacted kind of the social media, the companies now? And then maybe we could explore what we think might happen with those companies going forward. So if you look at Meta, Pinterest, Snapchat, and maybe Instagram, like how have those companies been impacted by this?
Eh, it's weird. It's interesting. It's weird. I got down a 10-cent rabbit hole, so I'll try to pull myself out of that, but we can get into that eventually. Another company I didn't realize until I was digging into the research is Reddit is kind of like another social media platform, kind of depending on how you think about it. Maybe it could be like a blog with comments, but I saw at least one person was a little disappointed in where those numbers are trending. So the KPIs to really hone down on in this industry, DAU and MAU, daily active user and monthly active user. Basically, who are the people who are logging into these platforms and actually getting on there and generating advertising dollars for these platforms? According to the guy on Twitter, it was either DAU or MAU was decreasing for Reddit. But when I looked in fiscal and the quarterly numbers, everything seemed great. Like they are growing user base a lot. So when you look at a company like Reddit, which just IPO'd a year or two ago, it was pretty recent. From a user growth perspective, I don't see much happening for Reddit. And maybe that makes sense because if you think about the context for TikTok, it's all video based and then Reddit is text based. So the investors like myself who want to always blindly apply numbers and metrics and financial data to these companies, missing the forest for the trees and understanding, okay, these are two separate kind of business models. Essentially, you're targeting different use cases. For Meta, I don't know what you found for Meta, but I found that frustratingly, they've changed their KPIs recently. So we've gone to whatever the KPI was before to now it's a family number. And from what I could see for this company, Meta, there was no distinction between is this a Facebook user, is it an Instagram user, or is it, uh, I'm always blanking on this third one,
WhatsApp.
a WhatsApp, thank you, user. And I don't know how to figure that out. And so maybe it is affecting Instagram, but they're able to cover it up by showing higher growth in Facebook users or WhatsApp users. So I don't know. Did you find something about Meta?
Um, no, I mean, I think really the only thing that it is interesting that they changed their KPIs, and the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that they did that because they don't look as good, and so now they're air quotes trying to cover it up.
Yeah.
But I have zero proof of that. That is just 100% speculation on my part. The companies will change KPIs to always make their company look better in a longer view. And so I think about, for example, Netflix removing the KPI of how many subscribers they have. Like that was a huge driver for the business, and now they appear to be switching away from that. And so it's interesting that Meta is doing the same with their company, that they're switching away from the bedrock of what has driven their company all these years. So it makes you wonder why they're doing that. Now, the thing that I don't think anybody could argue is that Instagram with their reels and YouTube with their shorts have had those are a direct reflection from the threat that TikTok presented to those companies. And they've had a huge impact on the social media impact and effect here in the United States, not only from those businesses, but also just from the social part of those apps, in that there are now, gazillions of Instagram influencers that are based solely on their videos. And there's lots of people doing that with TikTok. Now there's lots of people doing that with YouTube. And I'm sure that if Elon had his way, Twitter would be the same, or X would be the same. So I think there's no question you can say that TikTok has had a huge influence on those businesses, and for probably the better, has made them stronger and made them more profits and made them more popular than probably ever. Who here can't not doom scroll on Instagram for half an hour, right? That's, I think, a very normal part of a lot of people's days now. And that's a direct reflection on the pressure that TikTok put on a company like Meta.
Yeah. One KPI I did find interesting. So before they had changed the KPIs, they had two KPIs that I kind of find important in understanding how Meta's business model is evolving. You have the what they call the daily active people, and that was like family daily active people. And then they have average revenue per user. That's a common metric used in software businesses. It's ARPU, ARPU, short for average revenue per user. Basically, how well are you monetizing the person who's on your app every single day? So, in the time period between 2019 to 2023, so a 4 year period, the daily active number of people was up 9% a year, average revenue per user 11%. However, once you, which is interesting that this coincides with when they changed the metrics. When they changed the metrics, the growth rate for the average daily people reduced. So now it's more like in the range of 6 or 7% instead of 9%. So you're seeing a slowdown of the number of, not the number of people, but the growth of the people joining Meta's group
Form.
of platforms,
Yeah.
while average revenue per user continues to rise quite a bit. So it's almost gotten to a point where it's like doubling the growth rate of the user, which by itself, in and of itself, is not a bad thing to have to be a business that's getting more profitable. But when you think about what Instagram and Facebook are essentially doing, is to your point about the doom scrolling, if you're getting higher average revenue per user, you're getting them to stay on the platform longer. You're getting them to watch more ads. Sure, some of that is ads being more expensive as the economy grows, but if it's growing much faster than GDP, then that's just simply people engaging more on the platform. So, is the TikTok effect, to your point? Yes, people are getting more addicted to the platforms, but is TikTok also slowing the growth for the actual number of people joining Instagram or joining Facebook? And to me, I think, at the great risk of just leaping to conclusions and thinking I found the answer because I saw some numbers, I think both things can be true. That TikTok is stealing some of that user growth, but also somehow contributing to this idea that we're just getting more and more addicted to social media.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, those are really good insights, and I think I would agree with your interpretation of the numbers. The question I would have about that is, as the as the, I guess, ARPU continues to grow and the amount of people joining the platform flattens out, at some point you have to think that that reaches a critical mass number where
Yes.
they can only squeeze so much juice out of that. And
Yes.
I, what that number is, could be 125, per, you know, per person. Who knows? But it is definitely something to keep an eye on, because if that starts to go the wrong way, then that is when you could start to see trouble. And not only for Meta, but for any company that's measuring on ARPU. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. So even though they aren't giving us the same KPIs, I think you could still come to some interesting conclusions based on what is available.
Yeah. It was hard because you had to move between time periods, but
Right.
6.5 versus 11 is
Mhm.
a big difference from a year to year to year, and then that compounds. So, to your
Yes.
point, yeah, I do wonder what that critical mass is.
Mhm.
If you're a Meta shareholder, are you worried about this at this point in time?
Um, it is certainly, I would say for me, it would probably be a yellowish flag, where
Mm.
this is something that I would probably be looking at on a quarterly basis, especially as he's trying to double down on the whole AI thing. And I was just reading an article about the connected glasses that they were talking about. And so how that's going to play out and how AI is going to play out, I think Zuckerberg is smart enough. I know he's smart enough to see what we're talking about, or the air quote writing on the wall kind of thing. And I think he's desperately trying to figure out a way that they can pivot, maybe not away from that, but to add another revenue stream to the business. And whether that's through AI or whether that's some sort of device like the glasses, I think that's why he's doubling down on that, particularly the AI, is he's looking for another avenue for revenue.
Why do you think hardware?
Uh, Probably my guess is that they are looking, I think everybody in the AI space is looking for a way to move past the phone as a
Mm.
way of offering an iPhone-like experience, in that everybody wants one, but I don't think anybody's really settled on, this is going to replace the iPhone or the Android phones. And so, there was some mention about the lapel buttons, with AI activated to those, and those were kind of a flop. And I think glasses are a thing that some people seem to think that it could be a potential. If you've ever seen the movie Wall-E, the old Disney movie, where they all wear the VR glasses and sit in the chairs and drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, that could be a precursor of the future, right? And so maybe that's why companies are testing the waters with these things, to see if that is something you could catch with that. And if it could, for Meta, that could be huge. If they could combine their software with the hardware, that would be a pretty winning combination for them, for sure.
The irony that, I mean, I don't have a dog in the fight, but the irony that his Instagram and Facebook is a big reason why people hate smartphones. And now he's, to your point, trying to defeat the big bad wolf of smartphone, this
Right.
evil villain that he created, helped create.
Yes. Yes. Yes, for sure. Well, and he's also got an ongoing battle with Apple itself,
Mm.
with how they've treated apps on the phone, and just, the gatekeeping that they've done. I'm sure that rankles with him. And so if he could figure out a way to, as your point, to defeat the big bad wolf of the iPhone, I think that would make it even sweeter for him.
Well, to the whole point of this discussion, we're seeing how the government can, through Apple and Google, exert this control that TikTok is facing now. That maybe if TikTok had their own AI glasses, they wouldn't have as much problem with distribution and all these things.
Right. Yep. Yep. Exactly. So I'm curious. You mentioned Tencent a minute ago.
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. I frankly don't know much, if anything, about the business. So you said you went down a rabbit hole. What were you searching for, and did you find anything?
I didn't know what I was searching for, so I guess I didn't find what you would hope I was looking for.
Right.
So Tencent they are public, but they're traded on a Chinese exchange, so not something I would ever look at in this point in time. But they own WeChat, and WeChat is basically a super app. And again, to be the guy who's going to talk about something he's never used personally, WeChat is a super app, which means that not only is it a social media app, but it also is a place where people are comfortable making payments. So they have a WeChat Pay is a thing that's super big there. So a lot of people they kind of transact, almost combining a lot of apps into one single app. So it's very big in China. And that article I was talking to you about by Connie Chan in the Andreessen Horowitz blog talks about how just the concept of it is something that different companies have tried to go down this path in the United States and then hit roadblocks and then pivoted away from this path. But this idea of, instead of trying to horizontally take market share, you have a popular app. Let's say you have Airbnb. Rather than vertically integrating, they're horizontally integrating, which means they are, okay, we're in the North America, we're going to go to South America, we're going to go to China, we're going to go all across the world. And that's how we're going to expand our market share. What Tencent did is the opposite. They vertically integrated. And so with WeChat, You could pay for your bills, your utilities. You could do peer-to-peer payments like a Venmo or a PayPal. You can stream videos. You can text other people with WeChat. Like I said, you can pay for other things as well. And so it's created this flywheel basically where now they can partner with other service providers and then people can just stay on the one app rather than having to switch between 5 or 6 different apps to do what they want to do. Where that becomes interesting is this is an older article, but I was talking about how like DoorDash had announced that they were selling and delivering cosmetics from Sephora, where you could still stay on DoorDash and have that done. And then Uber spinning off Uber Eats and then bringing it back to the Uber app. It's interesting to see if does that become a trend? Do people start to learn from what's happening at Tencent and try to make it happen here? Do you remember who was there were some big tech guys who were trying to make their own version of a super app here in the United States, and then it flopped and they kind of moved on to other things. Did Jack Dorsey ever talk about that? He did.
Yeah, that was one of his ambitions when he started now Block, that then Square. That was one of his ambitions, was to create some sort of super app. PayPal was also, that was mentioned a lot in the, like, during the pandemic period. That was mentioned a lot in earnings calls and whatnot, that was their aspiration, was to create. And that's why they were buying all these different businesses at that time, was because they were trying to kind of create a super app. And there's been other companies probably too. I think, Elon has kind of thrown out, I think he's always had that idea because of his time at PayPal, that he really wanted he really wants X to be kind of a super app where there's payments involved, there's entertainment involved, and those kinds of things. And so far those dreams have been unfulfilled. So we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, for sure, there's been a lot of conversation here in the U.S. about with bigger companies trying to do that.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately for Tencent, it hasn't fixed their user growth problem. And I'm calling it a problem just again on 2 points of data and 2 separate places in time. But if you look at 2019 to 2024, the combined MAU, monthly active users, for Wixen and WeChat, which is, just think of it as just WeChat, only 3.5% annual growth in users. So again, any business that's able to grow users, able to grow number of units if you're a restaurant, number of stores if you're a store, that's going to give you usually above average growth just on its own. So we shouldn't sneeze at the fact that they are continuing to grow. But have they reached the saturation, and then has TikTok perpetuated that and made it that much harder for a social media company like this? I wonder if that's the case. And then the bigger thing I'm looking at with TikTok is, if this deal goes through, if they do have this US based app, and we know Andreessen Horowitz will be involved, do they try to learn from what Meta and Tencent are going through with the inevitable slowing saturation of user growth? And do they try to parlay that into creating this sort of super app that hasn't been seen, that every US company has tried and failed up to this point in time? But are they somehow going to take advantage of that? I think could be very, very interesting, not just for those companies involved, but just for what happens in the social media space in general.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think that could be a fascinating way to see how these companies try to use popularity of one particular aspect of their business to try to pivot to other ones, and see if they can continue to, if they can create some sort of optionality that they can kind of start to pivot off of maybe what was their air quote cash cow into other aspects of the life. When we're talking about these super apps here in the United States, it reminded me, I read an article a while back about why this person was kind of speculating why they thought these companies weren't able to gain much of any traction here in the United States, and they were suggesting that China, the reason why WeChat has worked so well in a place like China was because their culture was a mobile first culture, and so it allowed them to create an ecosystem that allowed WeChat to connect to all those other businesses and become a super app. Where here it's a lot harder, because if you want to, for example, if you want to have an entertainment part of your super app, for example, then you got to work out something with Netflix, right? And how willing are they going to be to allow PayPal, for example, to access their platform, and a movie theater or a restaurant or Uber, all those things. How likely is Uber going to be to allow PayPal to access their platform through the PayPal app when they could just entice people through the Uber app itself? And so I'm not saying none of these things could happen. I'm just saying those are the hurdles that they have to go through. Whereas I think in China that they didn't have a lot of those hurdles. They were able to, because it all kind of happened at the same time, they were able to I guess organize everything such that it made it easier to be seamless to order a cab, pay for a pizza, order tickets to go to on a trip, and to pay your phone bill all in the same place. Whereas here, I think it's just more difficult to do that.
So for whatever reason, for it to be built here, you have to your point, make those relationships with the big enterprises who, if they don't see the scale, they might not see the benefit. Like, oh, this isn't worth our time. You're just an inspiring super app or whatever it
Right.
is.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know what the conditions were in China, but for whatever reason, you're saying the way it played out in the timeline, it all naturally came together pretty nicely.
Yeah. Yeah. It was kind of the, right time for everybody to work out well.
Well, as the payments guy, do you get excited by the idea of a super app? Do you think it's better for consumers, worse for consumers?
Well, I think unquestionably it would probably be better for consumers, right? If we had one place we could go to do everything, that would make our lives easier. Uh, to use an example, let's say that you want to log into your Netflix account on your phone, but you haven't used it for so long that you forget the password. So now
Yeah.
you got to try to remember the password. And then because you haven't used it for so long, maybe the debit card that you're using to pay for it 9 months ago expired and you got a new one. And so now you have to go through the rigmarole of trying to, figure out how to put your credit card payment back on Netflix. And if it doesn't connect to the bank, or if it doesn't connect to, you want to use PayPal's app to do it, and they don't accept that payment, that's just another friction to try to get everything done. And that's happened to me. And maybe not Netflix, I think it was some other app, but it's happened to me before, and it's super aggravating, because what should be, a minute and a half transaction ends up taking 15 or 20 minutes out of your life, and adds to, the blood pressure and the stress level increasing in some cases substantially, right? So yeah, I think it would be yeah, I would be a user of it. So there's that.
I would love to see in the comments if anybody uses WeChat in China. Um, Tencent, 90% of their revenue is probably unsurprisingly all from mainland China. I would be curious if people have that experience between US App Store and using WeChat in China. Is it demonstrably better? And it's funny sometimes we don't really talk about it, but if you zoom out sometimes and you look at why do we as consumers in the United States, why do we do the things that we do? And oftentimes it's just dictated by the marketplace, what's going on with businesses, what's the business environment. Okay, the business environment's fragmented where there's just a million different apps. So we all use a million different apps and just think that that's normal. To your point, I can see where it can be very attractive to just have three apps or something that do this vertical, that vertical, that vertical. That could be really nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even moving beyond the payment, think about like the entertainment part of it. Like if you watch a lot of streaming, you have Netflix, you have Disney Plus, you have Apple Plus, you have Amazon Prime, you have
Right.
Peacock, like just infinite choices. What if there was only one or two of those,
Mm.
right? And you could just access
Hmm.
and get all the entertainment you want from that one place. That would be bliss, and we're not there yet.
You mean like cable TV?
Oh, hey.
We are going to go full circle as a society. I absolutely
Yes, we
love it.
are, right. Yeah, right.
Okay, just a couple other stocks that we have to mention because we mentioned them earlier. Pinterest and Snapchat, just kind of pulling up their numbers and looking at what's happened. These are very young companies, so the amount of data that's available publicly about them is quite limited. But for Pinterest, they actually peaked a few years ago in users and haven't reached that peak again. Snapchat's done this little mini hill that they've gone up and then down. 2022 being their peak of about 100 million daily active users. Now they're down to 98. So almost 3 years and they've come down. It's still higher than pre pandemic. So they're up like 2.4%. But Snapchat not really seeing that user growth. And so if we summarize this episode, Reddit has the user growth from everything I saw in my just big picture overview looking at the KPIs. Snapchat, no. Pinterest, no. Facebook, slowing. Meta, I'm sorry, slowing. And Tencent, slow. Where does that leave us with TikTok? And if you're screaming at us like, why haven't you given us TikTok numbers? Well, sorry, they're a private company.
Yeah,
We
we
don't
don't
have this
we don't know.
this data publicly available. But
Mhm.
it makes me wonder how much of this is TikTok effect and how much of it is just overall market saturation. I don't know if we have a
Right.
good answer for that.
No, I don't think we do, and until this deal goes through and we can start to see some of those numbers, maybe then we'll have a better idea of whether this is a saturation effect or whether it's a TikTok effect.
Yeah. No, very well said. How would you look for opportunities in this space? Let's say you're interested in social media. Let's say you're interested in Apple App Store, whatever it is. How does an investor figure out if these are the right type of stocks for them, and how do they go about finding the right stocks for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I guess a couple things that probably spring to mind would be to look at those KPIs that we were just talking about and determine what of those companies do you feel like have not only growth in front of them, but what other avenues could they try to pursue? So Snapchat and Pinterest are seeing lower growth in their user numbers, and that will correspond down into the revenues. And so if you're interested in those kinds of businesses, maybe you want something that is unloved, so to speak. And if you look at Pinterest, that probably would fall into that category. So, what would make you think? What kind of catalyst would you find in a company like Pinterest that could spur future growth or get the market excited about this business again? And what do they have cooking under the hood that could be another growth driver for them? Kind of the same with Snapchat, and the same would be with Meta. The big question with Meta, like we discussed, to me is going to be how much how much more juice can they squeeze from the users, because it looks like they may be reaching a saturation point at some point. 3.5 billion users out of seven or 8 billion users on the planet. You got to think at some point, unless they can double up on people, it's got to start reaching a point at some point. Whether that's today or tomorrow, I can't say that, but that is something you definitely want to understand where is Meta trying to go and how likely is this AI thing to play out or a device thing to play out. If I think about trying to play the longer game, would be to look at somebody like Apple and think about the app. services and the App Store because it's gone through some serious legal challenges over the last few years. And it appears that they have some pretty strong legal ground to stand on. And so, as much as people may rail against that, it doesn't look like that part of that business is going anywhere anytime soon. And so, the thing I think you'd want to look at is how much Apple growth will still come from the iPhone and future iterations of that, and how much is going to come from the services part of the business. And if you can you wrap your brain around that, I think that would be a pretty interesting way to play this. And the other way to play it would be to do some research on Reddit, right? If they're the one that's growing the fastest of all of them, it's not a platform I use much, if at all. So I will admit I'm not familiar with it very well, and I certainly don't know much, if anything, about the business. And so it would behoove you to look at that, and then look at some of the other social media out there, not just here in the United States, but maybe other global ones, and see if there's anything out there that might be interesting to look at. But I would definitely check the metrics that we talked about today. ARPU, a big one, and daily active and monthly active. If they provide those numbers, I think that would be helpful too.
Yeah, great place to start. I like that framework a lot.
Thanks.
I like it almost as much as the TikTok deal framework. How about that?
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost as much. All right, folks. Well, with that, we will go ahead and wrap up our conversation for today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion on TikTok and its effect, and some of the social media and what's coming down the pike. It could be a very interesting place to invest, and it would certainly behoove you to look into some of these companies and see if they offer an opportunity to find a good company. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign us off. You guys go out there and invest with a margin of safety, emphasis on safety. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you all next week.